Hello and welcome to SKANS ECampus. SKANS ECampus is a gold-approved learning partner of ACCA. On this channel, we bring you demo videos of different courses available at SKANS ECampus. So don't forget to subscribe to our channel to get notifications of additional videos and hit the like button.
In the last session, we covered assertions. We now know from our sessions before that substantive procedures are procedures applied by the auditor to test assertions and gather evidence. So while we looked at what assertions are, we still have to look at what evidence is and what procedures. So let's first look at evidence. What do you understand from the word evidence? Evidence simply means proof. And we have already covered this word before. Remember, in elements of assurance engagement, we covered that there are 5 elements of an assurance engagement. 1. Three-party relationship. 2. Subject matter. 3. Suitable criteria. 4. Evidence. And 5. Report and opinion. We are talking about evidence over here. And evidence simply means proof. So when we are testing assertions and when we are sort of testing whether they are true or fair, we need to gather evidence as well. This evidence has to be good for it to form a basis for our conclusion. So what is good evidence? What characteristics does good evidence have? Good evidence or reliable audit evidence should be A. Sufficient and appropriate. Now, sufficient talks about the quantity of audit evidence, so how much audit evidence is required, while appropriate talks about the quality of audit evidence, what kind of audit evidence is required. So, evidence should be sufficient and evidence should be appropriate. Sufficient is the quality and appropriate is the sufficient is the quantity and appropriate is the quality. There are several factors that affect the quantity of audit evidence that the auditor is going to gather. First, the first factor that affects the quantity of audit evidence is risk. Now, the riskier an area, the higher the risk associated with an area, the more the audit evidence will be required. So the quantity of audit evidence will also increase. Because if an area is risky, then there are higher chances of error and fraud within it, which means that the auditor will have to gather a higher or a more quantity of audit evidence in order to conclude whether that area is true and fair or not. The second factor that affects the quantity of audit evidence is materiality. If an area is material, then higher quantity of audit evidence will also be required. Material means significant. The more significant an area, the higher the form of audit evidence that will be required, or the higher the quantity of audit evidence that will be required. Similarly, controls. An area with strong controls will require a lower quantity of audit evidence, while an area with weak controls will require a higher quantity of audit evidence. Why? An area with strong controls will have lesser chances of error and fraud. Therefore, the auditor will have to gather lesser quantity of audit evidence. Vice versa, an area with weak controls will have a higher risk of fraud and error. Therefore, the auditor will have to gather a higher quantity of audit evidence. Next is the auditor's understanding of an area. If the auditor understands an area properly and understands the nature of an account, then lower quantity of audit evidence will be required. Since the auditor understands it, the auditor will have to gather lower form of audit evidence in order to form a conclusion. An area that the auditor does not understand will require a higher quantity of audit evidence as well. The last is the quality of audit evidence. Remember, if the audit evidence is of good quality, then lower quantity will be required. so lesser audit evidence will be required. If the quality of audit evidence is poor, then a higher quantity will be required. So quality and quantity are inversely proportional. The higher the quality of audit evidence, the lower quantity will be required. And the poorer the quality of audit evidence, the higher the audit evidence will be required. But what exactly is quality of audit evidence? What does this mean? For this, you will have to look at appropriateness. So, what are the factors that affect quality of audit evidence? Remember, when we say appropriate audit evidence is required, we mean audit evidence should be reliable, should be trustworthy. Now remember, the first most reliable form of audit evidence is evidence generated by the auditor themselves. So, evidence that is generated by the auditor themselves is considered the most reliable form of audit evidence. And the more reliable the audit evidence, the lesser the quantity of audit evidence required. The second most reliable form of audit evidence is evidence generated from an independent source, like a third party. For example, evidence generated from a lawyer, evidence generated from a valuer, or evidence generated from another expert. You have to remember this. The third most reliable form of audit evidence is evidence that is internally generated by management, but only if controls are strong. Documented audit evidence is more reliable than verbal audit evidence, and original documents are more reliable than photocopied or faxed versions. So this is how the auditor judges the reliability of audit evidence. If it is generated by the auditor themselves, then it is the most reliable form of audit evidence. If it is independently sourced, then it is the second most reliable form of audit evidence. The third most reliable form of audit evidence is that is generated by the management, but only if controls are strong. Evidence should be documented, and evidence should be in the form of original documents. So these are the parameters, or these are the factors that affect audit evidence. But what exactly are procedures? So what procedures will be applied by the auditor in order to gather this evidence? First form of procedures are analytical procedures. Remember, these are comparisons. So whenever the auditor makes comparisons, they will be called substantive analytical procedures. So comparison of current figures with last year's figures, comparison of current figures with competitors' figures, comparison of current performance with budgets or forecasts will all be analytical procedures. Second form of substantive procedures could be inquiry. Inquiry from management. Inquiry can be made from receivables, suppliers, lawyers, valuers, so on and so forth. Remember, this inquiry should be written in the form of confirmation letters. So whenever inquiries are made from receivables, suppliers, lawyers, or valuers, these inquiries are written and in the form of confirmation letters. But when an inquiry is made of management by the auditor, it will be written and it will not be called a confirmation letter. It will be called a written representation. So inquiries made from management in written form are called written representations by the management. Substantive procedures could be in the form of inspection of documents. Examples of documents that can be inspected could be loan agreements, ownership documents of assets. So ownership documents of assets. They could be invoices, purchase invoices. They could be requisitions. So inspection can be made of documents. Substantive procedures could be in the form of observation of processes in order to test a process, reperformance or recalculation. For example, recalculation of the depreciation charge for the year, reperformance of reconciliation statements, so on and so forth. Normally, when an entire statement is recalculated, it's called reperformance. For example, bank reconciliation statements. And when one figure is being checked, it is called recalculation. For example, depreciation charge. So remember, just to summarize the sessions, substantive procedures are procedures applied by the auditor to test assertions and gather evidence. Assertions are promises made by the management to the auditor. Evidence is gathered to test these assertions. Procedures are applied. In the next few sessions, we are going to be covering the audit of particular account balances and classes of transactions.
If you like this video, visit our website www.skansecampus.com to purchase the complete course at affordable prices. Register today at no cost and access our free 10-day trial.